Well, hello, Professor Anderson.
Well, Professor Reynolds.
It's really good to have you with us. This is our YouTube channel, Exploring the Quran and the Bible, and the goal of our discussions is to just have straightforward but hopefully interesting discussions about questions in biblical and Quranic studies. I'll give you sort of a formal introduction in a moment so our viewers will know a bit of your own academic work, and it's really great to have you with us, so thanks for being here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So friends, Professor Gary Anderson is Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Thought in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. His particular area within our department here at Notre Dame is called Christianity and Judaism in Antiquity, which is principally biblical studies, although some other things about Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity as well. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think the idea began with Robert Wilkin and Joseph Blenkinsop, who were on the faculty about maybe almost 30 years or so ago, of placing the Bible within the trajectory of both developing Judaism and Christianity. You might want to say decentering a maybe overly Protestant focus on the canon alone, but trying to bring the reception of the Bible into this notion of its study.
Right. That's very interesting. I should have known that. Now I do. He is interested in various dimensions of biblical studies. I think of him as the big Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholar, but he's worked on a lot of things beyond that in Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, and if you begin to read his books, which you should after purchasing them, and copies for your family, you'll see the breadth of his scholarship. He wrote a very influential work entitled Sin, a History. Great title and great book. That was published with Yale University Press in 2009, and that was followed up by a book called Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, also with Yale in 2013, and more recently has published Christian Doctrine in the Old Testament with Baker Academic, and a book which I guess is a collection of essays, Creatio et Ex Nihilo, Origins and Contemporary Significance. I was going to mention also an older work that you published entitled The Genesis of Perfection. This is way back in 2002 when we were very, very young. Adam and Eve in Jewish and Christian Imagination. So that's just a taste of his scholarship. There are many other works. But can we start with a biographical note? Can you just share with us a little bit about how you entered into the field of biblical studies? Where did it begin, and what were the various steps?
Well, there's a lot of steps, but I suppose I began in biblical studies because I began my studies of the Bible as a Protestant. And as a Protestant, the Bible, of course, is the heartbeat of theology. So I thought, mastering the Bible would put me, at the center of, what the Christian, what Christianity wants to claim about truth for our world. I think as I slowly began to study the Bible, especially on the academic side, and get to see what the Bible looked like when it was received in a Jewish frame of reference as opposed to a Christian frame of reference, I began to see that it's not simply the study of the Bible and its historical context or historical origins that determines its theological shape as much as its reception, we might want to say, in the early church and early synagogue. So I saw very early on that there was a sharp distinction frequently made between Jewish and Christian readings and understandings of the Bible, and that made a deep impression on me. It certainly showed me that there was more to the Bible than simply the Bible itself, and got me very interested in the reception of the Bible.
Okay, that's a big question. I want to return to the question of Jewish and Christian readings of the Bible. Before we jump ahead to that, however, I usually like to ask people something outside of their field of research or their academic life. So could you share a little bit about what Gary Anderson does when he's not studying the Bible? Are there, hobbies, books you read, shows you watch, sports you play?
Yeah, I'm certainly like, movies, TV series. I'm always, looking out for recommendations for friends for what they like.
Do you have any recommendations for us?
Well, the one, it's rather, a little bit old in the tooth or long in the tooth by now, but certainly I loved Breaking Bad and the prequel, Better Call Saul. I use clips from both of those actually in my classes. I think they both have within them embedded serious theological and philosophical questions that are very useful pedagogically. So I very much...
I made it through the first episode of Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
And that was it. I think I was watching it with my wife. We watched that first episode, and we're like, wow, this is intense. It's a little too much, but maybe we should have kept at it.
Well, I'd have to confess my wife won't watch the show because it is violent.
Okay.
But the violence is never, violence for violence' sake. I don't think that's always, aimed at a very constructive goal in terms of the plot of the show.
Right.
So I'd certainly argue for persevering, but it's like everything in TV, it's a choice.
I learned to watch, I think in part, you weren't the only one who recommended Terrence Malick's movies to me, but you were part of the reason why I started watching them. Thin Red Line and Tree of Life and the one about the martyr and the Austrian.
Oh, Jägenstätter, The Hidden Life.
Yes, Hidden Life. Yeah, beautiful movies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful movie about Pocahontas as well.
Okay.
The experience of Native Americans encountering Europeans for the first time, and then the reverse. It's a beautiful movie. Blanking on the name of it.
Also
right
by
now.
Terrence Malick.
Also by Malick, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, let's get back to biblical studies. It's
Yes.
great to discover some of these. Okay, so here's a question that interests me as someone who's in the field of Quranic studies, which I often complain about because it seems to me particularly contentious, a lot of noise and distractions from academic research, sometimes, not always, but sometimes suspicions of someone else who disagrees with you that there's an ulterior agenda or there's something else going on, some accusations now and then. And I sometimes say, gosh, Quranic studies must be the most contentious field out there. But is that wrong? What's biblical studies like? Is there some contention, conflict in the field?
Yes, historically, of course, there have been tremendous, points of contention, both Protestant Catholic and Protestant on, any number of stories. I had a colleague, Michael Legaspi, who wrote a book on the origins of biblical studies, and one of the striking things about his book, it begins in 17th century in Germany. As Germany begins to unify as a nation state and begins to found, in Göttingen, for example, a research university for the first time, and there's a big debate as to whether they'll actually include the study of the Bible in the curriculum, because the differences between the Reformed and the Lutheran branches of the Protestant Church are so neuralgic that they don't want to reproduce those denominational differences within the university. They want to leverage the university towards the unification of the German people into a single state. So what happens in the story, as Michael Legaspi tells it, is that scholars who are working in biblical studies try to develop a methodology and a set of questions that will, short circuit these denominational differences. So a lot of people think of what's very interesting about his book is they think of the origins of biblical criticism as the pursuit of truth over against, whatever various, religious doctrines and dogmas might think.
Right.
Right. There's an element of that, but what Legaspi's book nicely shows is more complicated, that it's actually seeking a kind of historically neutral methodology that will put in parentheses all these, great but sometimes irresolvable, theological questions. And that's a problem that's really dogged biblical studies to this day, is that, it's sometimes difficult to bring to the level of overt discussion the kind of classic theological questions that animate most lay readers of the Bible. They're frequently, not the subject of scholarly research.
And what is sort of the atmosphere or the vibe, to use an expression my kids would use, in a place like the Society of Biblical Literature today, which I think is the principal sort of learned society where biblical scholars get together? Are there still sectarian or confessional concerns that influence biblical studies, or is everyone sort of on the same team that, no, we're here doing scientific research and we just let the historical critical work do its thing and without thinking about any confessional or religious questions?
So I think it's a very complicated question and not easy to answer. I think still the case would be in the field of biblical studies is that most people take an interest in the study of the Bible and begin to pursue it as an academic specialty on the basis of some religious commitment, one way or the other. Frequently what happens is as scholars rise the ranks within the Guild of Biblical Scholars, their religious questions or the religious dimension is either set aside, or sometimes people make the personal religious move from belief to agnosticism or atheism. So you'll have a lot of people in the field of biblical studies who are vociferous atheists who began, as, very determined and convinced believers. I mean, Bart Ehrman, for example, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who's maybe the best published, most widely read New Testament scholar. That's exactly, his story. He came up through Moody Bible Institute, went to Princeton Theological Seminary, eventually jettisoned his faith, went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's a great scholar. I have nothing against him as a thinker, but in his own person, he represents a kind of transformation. Yeah, that's been replicated, and I think because biblical studies in this country its center is gravitated away from theological schools to departments of religious studies, frequently in state, secular universities. The desire in all of those contexts, of course, is to produce a mode of scholarship that is not theological, and sometimes in the current environment, anti-theological. So it's a very contentious field. I think it's very difficult to navigate all the, the little, turns and eddies.
Yes. It must be dizzying to graduate students coming through the ranks or junior faculty too, thinking about how to avoid pitfalls and how to advance serious scholarly work with all these complications.
Right.
Okay, let's turn to the Bible itself. And, my own work is in Quranic studies, and I have interest in the Quran's relationship to the Bible, but I don't really know some of the key questions that are at the center of biblical studies. And one of them seems to me, but you can tell me if this is really an issue, the question of the nature of the Bible. Unlike the Quran, most scholars think that the Quran basically has all 114 chapters or surahs come from the same context. Most would say from the same author. Some might contend that there's at least redaction or editing that goes into it, so the stories are a little more complicated. But with the Bible, we have this dramatic contrast, right? And so how do you even begin presenting the Bible, the nature of this book that's written in at least Hebrew and Greek, some Aramaic in the Old Testament, and over centuries? Or here's another way to put the question. If a Martian came down, we have all these rovers now on Mars, I think. So if we found a Martian there, we brought him or her or whatever back to Earth, and you wanted to explain what the Bible was to them, like where would you begin? How do you present the Bible?
Well, to begin with the way in which you framed your question, you're exactly right. One of the things that certainly distinguishes the Old Testament, let's say, from the Quran or even the New, is that it's written over almost 1,000-year period. In fact, maybe even slightly over 1,000 years. So the historical development, change in language, context in which the books are written is extraordinary. And anyone who wants to study, the Old Testament has to have a pretty, wide range of, comparative literature at, his or her disposal to be able to properly, situate the books. And then what's, I think, really fascinating about the Old Testament is that by the time you get to near the end of the composition of that book, the final books know the books, from their that are at the origin, and they begin commenting and adapting those books into their own compositions. Right. So that is, I think that's one of the fun things of studying the Old Testament, is watching this corpus of literature grow and interact with one another. As opposed to what would I tell a Martian? I mean, I think basically the Bible is both within the synagogue and the church, the Word of God to humanity. But not an uninterpreted word. I think both within the synagogue and the church, there is not the notion, certainly, that you have in the Quran, that God, announces directly his will to a prophet, and he, as a kind of, faithful stenographer, takes down exactly what God has spoken. I think there is much more of a sense of the mediation of human authors in the process, and that one has to respect the human considerations in the composition of this book prior to running to make any text definitively, quote unquote, the words of God directly to humankind.
So is there a way, without positing that God is the author of the Bible, let's stick with the Hebrew Bible for the time being.
Mm-hmm.
Without positing that God is the author of the Hebrew Bible, and therefore, or Old Testament, and therefore it has a unity, is there a non-religious way of asserting the unity of the Hebrew Bible? Does that question make sense? Is there a way to say, no, this is a book and not just a collection of books?
Well, I think ultimately it is a religious decision. If you're not a religious person, the more sensible way to come at the Bible is to seek out, ancient Near Eastern parallels and to take every book and to interpret it against, that kind of background. And theologians do that as well. But I think one of the distinctive markers of a religious Jewish or a religious Christian reading is the sense that somehow this, corpus as a whole holds together. Not necessarily in such a way that you could, prove to a non-believer it does, but it's the presumption of belief of church and synagogue that it does, and interpretation then proceeds on that basis.
Okay.
It would be like, I often think of it, the current debate about, whether we should teach in the schools the origins of the country in light of, the founding documents from 1776 or go back to 1619 and, discuss the origins of our country from the perspective of slave trade, for example. That's a serious issue, and there's no, easy answer to that question. But if you look at, for example, Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and you think, well, just of his place in the life of the United States. I mean, that speech only works if you believe the founders were on to something fundamentally true and real that can be built upon. And that's really, Martin Luther King Jr.'s perspective in that speech is that, what the founders imagined was great. It hasn't been fully realized, and it's our task to do such. But, can you empirically prove that? Can you say that's right and 1619 is wrong? I think that would be hard to do. I don't know how you would adjudicate the matter. But the one perspective assumes that these documents from, the late 18th century are canonical and workable, reformable, and other construals of those documents don't assume such. And they're in a sense kind of starting points that various people have that are they're in a sense faith commitments. They're hard to adjudicate historically.
Right. Well, let's enter into faith commitments for a moment, and let's speak first about a Jewish perspective of the Bible. Hebrew Bible is, in a sense, the Old Testament. In a sense, it's not. So what's distinctive of a Jewish approach to the Bible? Maybe you could explain, some might have heard this phrase, Tanakh, as a way of labeling or presenting the Jewish approach to the Hebrew Bible or understanding the Hebrew Bible. Is that a good way of organizing sort of presentation of the Jewish reading of the Bible? Also, is there a key moment or like a focal point of the Bible from a Jewish perspective?
Well, certainly from a Jewish perspective, the first 5 books of the Bible are the most important. What is identified in the Jewish tradition is the Torah, a word that has, a rather wide range of meaning, but it can mean the totality of revelation. Jews will refer to the oral and the written Torah, for example. And when they say the written Torah, they mean both Torah, prophets and writings, the whole thing. But Torah then has that more narrow meaning of the first 5 books, and then an even narrower meaning of basically the laws, the halakha in Hebrew, that, Moses receives and that, Jewish tradition then elaborates. And that's really, in a Jewish reading, the heart, certainly, of the Bible, the heart of Scripture, are the commandments that Israel receives through the mediation of Moses.
And so even though maybe maybe some of the stories that are most familiar to an audience and associate with the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament involve Adam or Noah or Abraham. Moses as the instrument of the law, or the medium through which the law is passed, would be the central figure of the Hebrew Bible from a Jewish perspective.
Yes, certainly. Yes, certainly. So there's a great line, for example, in Rashi, the great medieval Jewish commentator, perhaps the greatest of all the medieval Jewish commentators, who measure greatness by citation and study. And he asked the question, why is it, given the importance of the delivery of the law, why don't we have that in the very beginning of the book of Genesis? Why do we have to wade 70 chapters into the Bible to finally get to the meat of the matter?
Exodus 20.
Yes. The very fact that he would ask that question tells you the significance of the legal material. And actually the rabbis asked the same question.
Yeah. I wonder if this is a dramatic difference maybe with certain strains of Christianity for whom the law is contrasted to grace, perhaps. And so there might be an inclination to look at the way Jews read the Bible and say, well, this is completely superseded, or this is, we as Christians, Christianity offers something fundamentally different and better. Well, okay, maybe we just leave it at that. But I wonder, for someone who's not Jewish, if you feel comfortable speaking about this question, what is your own sort of feeling about a Jewish reading of the centrality of law in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible? What can Christians learn from the importance of law to Jews? Any lessons or thoughts about that?
Well, I think first of all, Christians have to concede that is, with respect to the Old Testament, the center point. I think within Christianity, the way in which the law is understood is complex, not easily, reduced to a kind of soundbite for a presentation like
for
this. For YouTube. But I guess maybe, Calvinists, for example, will refer to the three usages of the law, which I think, would translate also into a Christian context. The first usage of the law would be to use the law to demonstrate our inability of keeping the law, ergo the need for divine grace. For someone like Luther, for example, people often don't realize this, but he found law both in the Old and the New Testament. So for Luther, the Sermon on the Mount was law. In other words, Jesus cites examples of the Old Testament, don't commit adultery, and then, ups the ante. Don't even look at a member of the opposite, sex with sexual desire, that's committing adultery, in your heart. And so for Luther, these commandments were impossible for anybody to keep. And so what they demonstrated was your need for Christ as a Savior outside the law. But that's by no means the only picture within the New Testament, and certainly within Christianity at large. The law serves another purpose of organizing civil life. No society can have, civil life without a law code. But then there's what Calvin called the third use of the law, which is also, I think, very prominent within Catholicism, which is for the believer advancing in the life of faith inspired by the work of the Holy Spirit to keep the law to enable a person to move on towards what Charles Wesley would call the perfection, the life of Christian holiness. And so I think you see this, very nicely illustrated, for example, in the book of Ruth, which is really a book about the law, but the way in which the individuals in that book keep the law is really quite extraordinary because they all go way beyond what the letter asks. Mm-hmm. They all see that, what the letter asks, is in each instance a kind of social good, but they want to maximize the good that could be achieved by that law.
Okay, so this is Ruth, who's a Gentile.
She's a Moabite.
And she comes to Israel because of her husband. She's a widow. Mm-hmm. She comes to Israel, and eventually there's back and forth with Boaz. Is that right?
Boaz, yeah.
Yeah, but what are the examples of keeping the law beyond the letter?
So there's a number of them. First of all, Ruth comes back and she goes into the field to glean grain in the
Right.
second chapter.
Right.
And you can find in Leviticus the laws for an Israelite farmer that he can't harvest his whole field. He has to leave the edges unharvested so that the poor can come in and glean and survive from the extra grain. And Boaz does that. We see that in chapter 2. But all the law demands is that the farmer simply make that available for the poor then to come in and glean. It doesn't say if a young woman is out there gleaning amongst young men that you must protect her from sexual predation, that you must provide her with water, all these things that Boaz does that go way beyond. He looks out for her safety, her comfort. It's not a matter of just all the law demands of me is that I let her, pick up loose grain on the side. He thinks, no, the law. What's the fundamental purpose of that law? It's that the poor will find a way to survive. And so here you have this young woman, presumably good looking, young, attractive age, and likely to be the victim of perhaps sexual assault. So Boaz goes out there and tries to make sure that won't happen. So that's one example. Why is she out there in the first place? Well, one of the most important laws in the Old Testament is honoring your father and mother, which means fundamentally providing for them in their old age when they're infirm. But who's going to provide for Naomi? Her sons are dead. There's no one to honor her. Who's going to provide for her? Well, there
this
you
is
see
Ruth's
Ruth.
mother-in-law.
Yes, so you see Ruth. It's a mother-in-law. She's not obligated to her mother-in-law.
That's a really good
but
point.
there she is out fulfilling that commandment.
Yeah.
And then the same thing for Boaz, who is going to redeem the land and then marry Ruth in a process of marriage called levirate marriage. But that's an obligation that's incumbent on the brother. He's not the brother. And the linkage of levirate marriage and redemption of the land is also unique to the book of Ruth. And part of the important feature of the 4th chapter of the book of Ruth is having this unnamed Mr. So-and-so on the scene, because his, he has first, you might want to say, dibs on redeeming this land, but when he finds out that redeeming the land also includes raising up a family through Ruth, he declines, and he's in there because that shows us that this isn't a desirable thing to do. Boaz, though, steps forward.
That's his narrative function.
Yes, and we can see that, Boaz is doing something that isn't in his financial self-interest, but he's going to do it anyways because he's fulfilling a command. So the book is extraordinary in that way. I like to see it really kind of illustrates the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, the law has this minimal, level of compliance asked of you, and it's not that hard to fulfill. But, ideally kept, the individual want to, ask, well, what is the larger social good or religious good that this law is really driving at? And that's what I want to, actualize in my life. And that's what happens with Ruth. Anyways, all of that, in a sense, is, I think, what someone like Calvin would call the third use of the law. Right. In other words, the law here is actually a fundamental good and inseparable from the religious life. Right. And is the guide, the path to, how we, make our lives conform to the person of Jesus Christ.
Right. And from Ruth and Boaz, I comes David.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah, it's the king and maybe prototype from a Christian perspective of the Messiah. Right. Okay, terrific. Let's step back a little bit further in terms of biblical books to Genesis, if that's okay. And I thought I'd ask you some questions about that. But the first is about the textual origin of Genesis, which brings up the larger question of the documentary hypothesis. When I was in graduate school, I TA'd for a class that was called Reading the Bible as Literature or something like that, and that's the first time I was introduced to the documentary hypothesis. So this is the idea that there are essentially 4 sources. I'm going to give a very sort of primitive approach to the documentary hypothesis, but essentially 4 sources, J, E, D, and P. So, for example, the first creation story would be from P, or the priestly source, and the second from J, or the Yahweh source. Is this still the thing? Do people still speak about the documentary hypothesis, or is this 19th century German scholarship that's been forgotten about?
We have to answer the question yes and no.
Okay, or yeah and nine.
Yeah and nine, yes, that's fine. In North America, there remain, we might want to say, some true believers in the four-source theory. In Europe and in large parts of the United States as well, that theory has by and large been dismissed. But having said that, that doesn't. What has not been dismissed is the notion that Genesis comes from a different set of discrete points of origin. So the one thing scholars are definitely agreed upon, for example, is what constitutes the priestly source. And then scholars will basically distinguish between the priestly source and the non-priestly writings. And the non-priestly writings, of course, can be divisible in any number of ways. But they don't all, the non-priestly materials don't sort out into the classic J, E, and D strains.
But the P does. The priestly source does.
Priestly source certainly remains. From the 19th century, that's been consistent.
Okay,
yes.
Which is the last, at least in the categorization of the documentary hypothesis.
That's also disputed, but generally people would say last, yes.
So priestly source, the way I was taught it, and again, maybe this is no longer the case or the consensus, is from the 6th century BC or BCE, so from the period of the exile.
Right.
And written by priests who had certain priestly concerns. Is that still?
Yeah, I'd say so. There's a kind of difference here between scholars who believe that determination of historical date then determines the kind of focus and interests of the priestly school. So everything that we have in the priestly school or priestly writings are going to be read through, let's say, the power politics of 6th century, Persian, empire. There are others that would say, well, the document probably comes into its final form then, but certainly had, points of origin that were earlier than that, and that its creation is really, in some senses, largely independent of its, the kind of final historical era in which it was assembled. So that group of scholars, of which I certainly would put myself, is, less comfortable in trying to line up every detail of the priestly composition with some contingent historical variable.
Right. Okay, so the classic example, which I already alluded to distinguish at least between the priestly source and what people used to call J, I guess.
Well,
what I did
we'll call
5
it
minutes ago.
non-P or whatever.
Non-P.
Yes, non-P, yes.
Are the two creation stories.
Right.
I don't even know if that's really an eloquent or proper way to put it. But what I've often thought about, the story of the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1, with all of the affirmations that creation is good, everything is good, and I think with a lot of symmetry, day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, day 3 and day 6, a lot of symmetry. And then the story of Adam and Eve in the garden that unfolds in Genesis 2 and 3 is, goodness, someone put these two accounts together, and there's no reason to think they're less sophisticated or observant than we are.
Right.
And so must have noticed some of the contrast, but still found a reason to put them together. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, the interest in, attending to how and why the stories were assembled the way they are is frequently, laid at the feet of Brevard Childs and Rolf Rendorf, who are both interested in what has come to be called canonical criticism. Both Rendorf and Childs did not deny by any means source criticism, but with respect to Genesis 1 to 3, if we just take that as one example, one of the things that both of them pointed out is that the verse that stands right at its seam, in a sense, has its foot in both worlds. So clearly, whoever is responsible for assembling, chapters 1 to 3, that figure wants us to read them together, right? But what Childs wants to argue
is just probe that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Is this Genesis 2,
4? Yeah.
2, 4.
Yeah.
And
these are the generations.
These are the generations.
So and usually the reason why people see this as, a redactional linkage that says we must read them together is most of the places in Genesis when we have that phrase in Hebrew, Eila Toledot, that introduces frequently a genealogy, of a priestly construction. But here, uniquely, it introduces a non-priestly writing altogether. So how do we explain that?
Oh, now it makes sense.
The easiest way to explain that is that, well, here we have, either the priestly writer, perhaps more likely a redactor who's familiar with the priestly style, introduces this, priestly terminology to now introduce us into this non-priestly story.
Right.
And we have lots of examples of that, and the scholarship is very interested in these redactional seams and the way in which the Bible has come into its final form. But in a sense, there's also a kind of division here among scholars, how there are many scholars that want to make sense of the final whole, recognizing these parts, that came at its beginning, and believe there's something intelligent to say about the final form and of these books. There are others that argue that the Bible is simply unreadable. It was just kind of thrown together. In fact, this one school that's very much still committed to JEP&D doesn't like to use the term redactor, because that conveys too much intentionality in the way in which these stories are stitched together. They use the term compiler, which you may know as a computer, computer term, just to compile code, just a kind of rote mechanical thing of assembling all of these pieces with no interest in, how they're to go together.
So they might take issue with your observation regarding Genesis 2:4 that it shows a certain intention.
There are some that would, yes, and so that's a kind of divide in scholarship of those who want to show, reasons for seeing an organic whole, and those that want to say there's no organic whole. It's just a bunch of shards.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask a couple of things about, I don't know if we'll fit all this in, because I don't want to try your patience.
Can I just add one short thing here? Even, Benedict XVI, for example, he wrote a short volume, while Erdman's published it, Homilies on Genesis 1-3. But if you read carefully, you can see that, he's a good biblical critic. He remarks that Genesis 1 was written in the 6th century, and that Genesis 2 and 3 were written, several centuries earlier. He doesn't use the term P and J, but that's clearly what he means.
So even the Pope?
Even the Pope, yes. Even the Pope,
is into biblical criticism. Yeah. Okay, good. That's a good affirmation for the field. So in Genesis 2 and 3, there's so much to say, and you've written a book about this, so maybe I'll just say sort of something crude about my own observations. It seems to me that if you took a really sort of non-confessional approach to the text, you could see this story about a snake and a man and a woman who's created from the rib of a man and a forbidden tree. Certainly as folkloric, mythical, but also as, to use a fancy word, ideological. It's explaining the origins of things, right? So it's explaining the origin of why snakes are a pain and they cause trouble, and why women have pain in childbirth, why men, according to classical divisions of labor, struggle from the sweat of their brow to produce food from the earth, etc. So, what do you think about that, and is there something more in this story?
Oh, I think all of those things are there. I think there's no question about that. But I think the bigger issue, I think, that's at stake in this story, that's already identified certainly in rabbinic writings, but moderns have found it attractive too. I can think of, for example, Joseph Blenkinsop of our own faculty, retired now for a couple of decades, but in his book on the Pentateuch remarks about the neat fit between the narrative dynamics of Genesis 2 and 3 and Israel's national story. So what is Israel's national story? She receives a set of commandments at Mount Sinai, enters the promised land, a land imagined like the Garden of Eden, flowing with milk and honey. She violates the commands on that land, and she's exiled, driven out. And then the rest of the Bible, the rest really of Jewish, tradition, is the hoped for return.
It could almost be a parable telling the story of Israel.
So Genesis 2 and 3 is really a kind of, a foreshadowing, you might want to say, of Israel's national story. I think that's the best way to read it, in my opinion.
That's very interesting.
Why it would be in the Bible, because it anticipates, as it were, what's coming. Adam and Eve receive a commandment. They violate the commandment, and they're driven from Eden. The cost of violating the commandment is, death. being exiled from the land of Israel is conceived of as a form of death. Restoration to the land is understood as a form of life. There are any number of levels where I think that works beautifully.
There's an interesting detail there, maybe 321, but I'm not sure, where God sows,
Yes. Garments of skin.
Garments of skin. Yeah. So I take that as a sign of compassion for the man and the woman, that he's not going to let them go out into the elements without some clothing.
Right.
Better clothing than fig leaves.
Yeah.
Is that what's going on there?
That's a good question. Of course, that verse, was susceptible to, enormous elaboration, both in church and synagogue, in a somewhat different direction. Won't bore you with here. But it was Gerhard von Rad who noticed that all of the stories, with the exclusion of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 1 to 11, all involve, a sin perpetrated by human agents, and then punishment by God, but then amelioration of the punishment. So Cain is marked with a sign so that, vengeance won't be taken on him. After the flood, God remakes his promise with Noah. So we have this cycle of, punishments, but then also amelioration of punishments. And so I think that the clothing with the garments of skin fits into that pattern that von Rad noticed.
Interesting. All right. Well, you just had a perfect segue into my next question, because you alluded to a section of Genesis 1 to 11. And I think that's a traditional sort of end point for a certain kind of primordial history. So there's a big question which comes next, which is what is different about Genesis 12? And can we actually start speaking of history with the introduction of Abraham in Genesis 12?
I think you can, but that doesn't mean, speaking of history, that we would want to say that everything in Genesis 12 to 50 is, a veritable, annal that we can, consult for, independent historical facts about the ancient world. But the reason why I think we might want to call it history is a lot of things change when we get to chapter 12. First of all, the personal names that people have are personal names we know from the ancient Near East. Av Ram or Avraham, the divine father Av has exalted. That's a sentence name of which we have a zillion from the ancient Near East. But when we look at names in Genesis 1 to 11, Adam, that means mankind. No one has the name man. There's no parallel for that.
East.
Yes. Or Noah,
Okay.
which means, rest. Hevel, Abel, which means vapor. These are all names that aren't names. So anyone who's reading this story in Hebrew, you just know that there's something weird here. It's a little bit harder in translation to capture that, because we have people named Noah, Adam, and Abel.
Yeah.
So we think these are bona fide names that are available for anybody. But in Genesis 1 to 11, that's not the case. We also have the fact that people in these chapters live, enormously long lives, which they don't live after chapter 12. And we also, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but most of the locations that are mentioned in Genesis 1 to 11, Garden of Eden, Land of Nod, they're not locatable on a map. It starts to change once we get close to the end of Genesis 1 to 11, but there's the kind of typography tells us this is a world from, or a place from nowhere. Whereas when we get to Genesis 12, all of a sudden, every place that's named, we can find it on the map. The names make sense. They're living, the period of lives that we would expect. The way in which Abram makes a covenant. All of these things have, parallels in the ancient world, and they can be compared to, real ancient Near Eastern texts. Now, it doesn't mean that they happen. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
That has to be determined on other grounds, but they certainly can be compared, usefully to, other historical sources.
For what it's worth, this is a parenthetical comment.
Yeah.
But, maybe the questions for textual study are not really important, the questions of history, since textual study usually involves other ways of finding meaning in a text. But there are big questions out there about the historicity of some of these characters, which in my field, in Quranic studies, they're just not asked. I find they're just not asked. It's really interesting how the two, it's almost so, as in biblical studies, the fallback position is that, of course, nothing's historical. In Quranic studies, it's just not asked because maybe it's considered to be too sensitive, but there's a great contrast there. Anyway, I wanted to go on and ask about something that also brings together Quran and Quranic studies and biblical studies, which is cases of characters in the Bible who are shared with the Quran, but in the Bible they act poorly. And this can cause scandal or sometimes be fodder for polemics against the Bible in the world of, not among serious academic scholars, but in the world especially of internet polemics between Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And let's just take the example of Jacob, who appears in the Quran as well. Both Isaac and Jacob appear in the Quran. His story is not very well developed, but he's there. He's widely considered to be a prophet in Islamic sources. In the Bible, he does very curious things, like steal his brother's birthright and blessing. Birthright by getting him to eat some porridge, and blessing by putting on a fur glove and duping or deceiving his own poor blind father.
Right.
Yeah. So why are these stories in the Bible? What function do they play in Genesis? And how could that function be redeeming or beautiful in any way?
So in the book of Genesis, if we were just to look at the moment of deception, of course, there'd be no, benefit to be had whatsoever. But in the Jacob cycle, and the same thing would be in the Joseph story as well. Joseph opens up in chapter 37 as, a person of, no moral qualification for the post he'll eventually hold. He's a tattletale, braggart. Everything about him is, very distasteful. But both of those stories are are really stories about the people of Israel as a whole. And the key element that you have to read the whole story, is the transformation of the characters over the course of the narrative. So if we take a look at what Jacob does at the beginning, first of all, it's important to note that he's going to suffer tremendously from those actions. He's going to be punished by his God. He has to retreat into exile, into Aramea, where he's going to be treated as a debt slave by his father-in-law Laban, mercilessly treated there. All of that, in a sense, payback, as it were, for what he did. But by the time, he's, basically served his time, let's say, in Aramea and returns to the land of Canaan, he's a changed man. He comes back to Esau bearing gifts. In fact, one of the terms in Hebrew for the gift that he's going to bestow to Esau is barakah, which is blessing. He's going to give Esau his blessing.
What he took from Esau.
Yeah, what he took from him. Right, so the story clearly wants to show, and Esau's changed too. And that's the beauty of the story, is that, in other words, why do we have that disassembling at the beginning and the immoral behavior? Well, because there's a challenge, that's established within the relationship between the two brothers that the story then, as it unfolds, resolves. And then the same thing happens with Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is such a, bratty, teenager that the brothers literally want to end his life. And think they do, not at their own hands, but selling him into slavery. They feel, he'll die there eventually. And of course, Joseph doesn't, and the story is so beautiful because at the end of the story, there's this, great reconciliation scene. So the bad behavior at the beginning sets the framework for the resolution at the end. And the bad behavior at the beginning is also very important. I think even Muslims would understand this. There's a challenge to being the people of Israel. It's not just a group of, 100% saints. I don't think any Muslim would want to say that the mosque is full of 100% saints. So the question certainly for Israel or for a Muslim or a Christian is, how do we get along with one another? And so one of the purposes, I think, of these stories within the book of Genesis is to give a realistic portrayal of who the people Israel, is. It's not a group of, of saints top to bottom. It's a mixed bag. And how are they going to work together? That's the challenge of the story. That's the beauty of the story. And really the same features underline the synoptic gospels as well. The disciples, especially in Mark, but also in Matthew and Luke, are made to look like, idiots is maybe too strong, but they don't understand who Jesus is. They're all in it for their own betterment. It's not until Easter, when he's risen again, that it finally dawns on them who this guy was. And so what we witness there, and the reason why the New Testament tells that story, is that we need Pentecost. They need, the Holy Spirit to infuse them and to, alter their way of seeing the world. They can't do it on their own.
Interesting.
And I think you have the same thing in the book of Genesis. The Bible, I think, is deeply committed to a realistic portrayal of all of these characters at their origin. Because in part, that's what the synagogue is. That's what the church is. Mm-hmm. And the story is about, how these differences, eventually become, healed. The differences,
right.
are managed.
Right.
That's the profundity of them.
Yes.
You eliminate that, then they don't match real life.
Really interesting. Well, there's some questions I didn't get in, but I want to get in a quick one at the end, which is, do you have a favorite biblical book?
Oh my goodness, I'm teaching Introduction to the Old Testament now this fall. I always joke with the students every section we get to, this is my favorite, this is my favorite book, this is my favorite story. So I don't know how to do that. I love the book of Ruth. As you know, I love the book of Tobit. I love the interaction between God and Moses after the sin of the golden calf. I love the Joseph story, Jacob's story. I don't know. I mean, I could speak at length about any of them.
I'm happy you mentioned Tobit. I wanted to ask you about Tobit.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll have another episode where we just focus on Tobit and introduce the world to that beautiful book. But and do you have any academic projects going on now that our viewers should know about?
Well, I'm just about done with a book on the building of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. That has to do with, the origins, we might want to say, of a holy place, church, synagogue, or what have you, and the origins of sacrifice and how it's told in the Bible and what its implications, might be for, Christian theology.
Great, beautiful. Thank you for that, and thanks for being with me today.
Thank you.